Hi, welcome to the Classic Guitar Rock channel. I'm Jeremy. I was on a work trip last week when the news broke about Jeff Beck, and I wasn't able to respond right away. Um, but I've had a few days to kind of think about it, and I wanted to come on here and talk about Jeff Beck a little bit. Jeff Beck, to me, probably the greatest guitar player ever. And why do I say that? I can think back to the early days when I started getting into guitar and getting into music and reading the guitar magazines. In the early 80s, there's always been Guitar Player, Guitar World, Guitar for the Practicing Musician. Those were the three magazines, as I was coming to age, in the early 80s that aspiring guitar players would read. And those of you that are younger, that are not of Generation X or baby boomers, but those of you that are a little younger, that have always grown up with the internet, you might not appreciate this or realize this, but those of us that are a little older, in our late 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Much of our life, there was no such thing as the internet. In fact, I remember, it was the early to mid 80s when you could start renting video cassettes, right? Early 80s, they start having, you could go to the video store and rent movies on video, and we thought that was the coolest thing ever. And what does that have to do with anything? Well, the flow of information was not like it is today. And when you would read these guitar interviews, every interview where they're talking about a great guitar player, somewhere in the interview, they always mention the four horsemen, right? Clapton, Page, Beck, Hendrix. Okay? Clapton, Beck, Page, Hendrix. Those four always got mentioned in every article. Rightly so. Very influential. And you would read about these things and really not have context, because you maybe had never heard some of these guys. I mean, you probably heard the hits, right? You had heard Led Zeppelin, so you kind of knew who Jimmy Page was. You had heard Hendrix. Everyone had heard Purple Haze and Foxy Lady and that sort of thing. Clapton, you'd probably heard Cocaine or I Shot the Sheriff or After Midnight or whatever. So you were aware of their mainstream stuff. But that might be about it. And it took effort to actually find music from you'd go to a record store and you'd dig through all the shelves and find records that you've heard mentioned, and maybe you'd buy one and you'd listen to one. But it was a lot different. Now you can go online, you can go on YouTube, you can go on Spotify, and instantly you can hear a Jeff Beck song or a Jimi Hendrix song or whatever. It was a different world in the late 70s, early 80s, even up into the early 90s. And so as a young, aspiring guitar player, fan of rock music, you would hear about Jeff Beck all the time and how great he was and inspirational. You'd hear about the Yardbirds and how the Yardbirds, but it was years later till we actually, most of us, were able to digest some of this music that was so influential and so historical. I know in one of the, I think it was the second episode I did of the Classic Guitar Rock podcast, we talk about the rock and roll family tree. And Jeff Beck, Page, Clapton, not so much Hendrix, he died too young, unfortunately, but they're all weaved throughout the roots of that rock and roll family tree. And Jeff Beck I bought my first Jeff Beck album. It was probably 1988 before I bought my first Jeff Beck album. First Jeff Beck album I ever bought was Wired. Came out in 1976. And I really liked it. And then I later picked up Guitar Shop, which I think came out in 89. So it was new. When it came out new, I bought it because I really liked Wired. I kind of went back and got Blow by Blow. I have the Truth album. I think I have There and Back. And I think I have Flash somewhere. Those are probably the only ones I own. But through the miracle of streaming, of Spotify, I've gone back and listened to probably all of his albums. And my opinion has kind of formed over the last 20 years as I've had the opportunity to actually dig deep on all of these four horsemen, right? Hendrix, Page, Clapton, Beck. And if anything, that has only intensified my belief that Jeff Beck is the greatest guitar player ever. Now, having said that, his albums aren't necessarily my favorite albums. And that might sound controversial, but I think one of the things that make Beck so unique is this point I'm about to make. I haven't looked at the numbers. I mean, if you compare Clapton and Page, I don't know who's sold more albums. I don't know. Maybe it's Clapton, maybe it's Page with Led Zeppelin and things. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But they were definitely successful. Okay, mainstream successful. Hendrix also, but again, Jimi Hendrix died in 1970, unfortunately, so he kind of stopped at that point, right? Beck could have been as big as Page or Clapton from a commercial standpoint, but Beck would do things that appeared to be self-sabotaging, right? He was notorious for having kind of a prickly personality. I don't know if that's the right word, because he seems like a very nice guy, but he was known to be a perfectionist and known to be the type of guy that if he didn't like it, he'd just leave. Right? And Rod Stewart could tell you stories about being on the verge of a tour and Beck pulls out, right? Or the Yardbirds, Jeff Beck pulled out at the beginning of it. It just wasn't for him. He said, no, I'm not, He was not a guy that was really compelled by money. I don't think he felt a need to make a lot of money. I don't think he really felt like he needed to necessarily do what the record company wanted him to do. He was, perhaps of all the four horsemen, I keep calling them the four horsemen. I don't know why I'm doing that, because I could call them the Fantastic Four, or whatever you want to call them. Of all those four, I can't call it the Holy Trinity because there's four of them, right? But of all those four greats, he was the one most likely to march to his own drum beat. He did things his way, oftentimes to his detriment commercially. Okay? He might decide, no, I'm not going to put out an album. I'm going to work on my hot rods. He's a big-time car guy, work on cars, whatever. But it's interesting when you hear interviews about Beck, interviews with Jimmy Page, with Eric Clapton. I think they, without maybe coming out and saying it, but you almost sense that they're acknowledging the fact that Jeff Beck was the best one. Of all four, he was the best. And then you add in other guitarists like Ritchie Blackmore. He would tell you Jeff Beck was the guy. Okay? Now, Jeff Beck, again, didn't have the commercial success as the years went by that the other guys did, but again, that was of his own choosing. Okay? He didn't want to. He didn't want to do what it took to have hit records. Instead, he did what he wanted to do. And that therein, to me, I'm torn by this because that's what makes him so great, right? That's one of the things that makes him so great. But at the same time, he would play stuff. Some of his albums I really like, some I don't like. Some I don't dig this. You know, he would explore areas that to me were just not exciting. They were not up my alley. I didn't like it. A lot of electronic experimentation, you know. I love rockabilly, but he has an album that's all rockabilly, and that's cool. You know, I like rockabilly, but again, some of it I love. Throughout, he's always brilliant. Okay, his playing is always brilliant, but for me personally, it didn't always resonate with me. Some of the albums I love, front to back, I love them. Others, not so much. But just a few things about Jeff that I noticed from Wired, from when I picked up Wired. So here's an album. It's a Jeff Beck album. And yet, Jeff is always happy to share the spotlight. Have you noticed that? You listen to a Jeff Beck album and you might hear as many Jan Hammer solos as you hear Jeff Beck solos, right? That's just kind of the way he was. There are places where he's definitely in the spotlight taking the solo or whatever, but there's places where a keyboard player might be or the other musicians he's working with. That's one of the things that's pretty cool about Jeff Beck. And even throughout his career, he's done that. He's allowed other people to shine in the spotlight. A lot of women, by the way. Jennifer Batten, Tal Wakenfield, you know, a lot of women have been in Jeff Beck's touring band and on his albums, and he's a mentor to a lot of people, men and women, which is impressive, you know. All the interviews I've seen with Jeff Beck, I like him. He's just a really cool guy. I like his attitude. The way he plays is unlike anyone else. And let me back up. I mentioned I hadn't even bought a Jeff Beck album till about 1988, but I'd heard him mentioned in interviews and all of this stuff. One of the secondhand loops back to Jeff Beck for me came by way of Gary Moore. So Gary Moore, another huge Jeff Beck fan. And I remember reading interviews with Gary Moore. This is around Corridors of Power time frame. Again, I only heard about Gary Moore in the guitar magazines because Gary Moore was never that big in the U.S. until he went through his blues phase in the late 80s. But in the early 80s, in the guitar mags, you could read about Gary Moore and Corridors of Power and Victims of the Future, two phenomenal albums, by the way. So I had those albums, you know, in the early 80s and in, you know, a little later when Victims of the Future came out in like 84. And I loved them. Well, he talked about Jeff Beck all the time, and I thought Gary Moore was just phenomenal. And I'm like, wow, if Gary Moore is so big on Jeff Beck, he's got to be really good. And I can remember when I went back and listened to Jeff Beck after hearing Gary Moore first, there were several things, technique, playing wise, that I'd hear Gary Moore do, and I go, that sounds like that lick on the Jeff Beck album, or that harmonic, pinch harmonic, that sounds like something Jeff Beck would have. He borrowed that from Jeff Beck. And as you watch more and more guitar players, and it might even be second, third, fourth hand, so much of what is regular routine stuff in the guitar vocabulary comes from Jeff Beck. And I don't know if people realize that. I think those of us that go back and listen to a lot of Jeff Beck, we probably do. But they talk about Jimi Hendrix and Jimmy Page and Tony Iommi, right? Kind of being instrumental in rock guitar, which they were. But you know what? Jeff Beck, just as much, maybe more so than those two. A lot of people don't know it just because he never had the mainstream commercial success. But one thing I would invite any of you to do is go back and watch some live Jeff Beck performances. There's lots of them out there. The live at Ronnie's is a phenomenal concert, and that's probably 5-6 years old. Great band. And to watch him play, and he doesn't use a pick, by the way. He used to, you can find older clips where he's using a pick, but he hasn't used a pick for years. And the sounds that he's able to get from his guitar, and not with a lot of crazy effects. I mean, he'll use effects, but just manipulating his volume and his tone controls and just the feel he has. It's like a space alien. It's unbelievable. He really was a genius. And on the one hand, the fact that he never really followed a commercial path, the bad part of that is that his work was not exposed to more people. The good part of that is that he was able to do whatever he wants. So if he had been following more of a commercial path, maybe we wouldn't have seen some of this crazy stuff. The last year or so, he was working with Johnny Depp, and in fact put out an album with Johnny Depp. And a lot of music fans, a lot of Beck fans are like, why the heck are you messing around with Johnny Depp? What's the deal here? Again, that's Jeff Beck. Okay, he does what he wants to do. He and Johnny Depp are friends. He liked playing with Johnny Depp, so he played with Johnny Depp. He recently did the Ozzy album, Patient Number 9. And over the years, he did an album with John Bon Jovi, or soundtrack with John Bon Jovi. He's done things with Rod Stewart. I mean, there's a number of commercial projects he's been involved with where he's contributed to an album. But for the most part, he has just always done it his way, done his own thing. And he will be missed. And he's been active the last 40, 50. I mean, he's had a few couple year spells where he hasn't put out albums, but for the most part, he's always putting out albums and touring. And he's a genius, and he will be missed. I hope you'll take a minute to go back and listen to some of his stuff, and I think you'll see that's pretty cool. That sounds like what so and so does now, only he was doing it in 1972 or whatever. But truly a genius and a giant. He was 78 years old. He died of meningitis. And it, from all accounts, it looks like he went pretty quickly and went peacefully. But it was a shock because he's been touring up until very recently, and recently released an album, and this came out of nowhere. So it wasn't like he had a long, drawn out illness or that anyone could see it coming. But Jeff Beck left a tremendous impact, and he will be missed. And as I mentioned earlier, and I invite you to spend some time digging into his albums. Go way back to the Yardbirds. Check that out. Just think of the Yardbirds. I mean, Clapton, Page, and Beck were all in the Yardbirds. You got to go back and listen to the Yardbirds. That's kind of the if it's not the roots, it's the bottom of the trunk of the family tree. You got to check that out. But I love Jeff Beck. I'll miss him. Rest in peace. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time here on the Classic Guitar Rock channel. Bye-bye.